What's going on? Welcome to Tech with Sean, and I recently put together this smallish form factor PC in the Fractal Torrent Nano to replace my existing living room PC. And I had planned on doing one of my normal build videos, but I ran into some problems along the way with the build, which you'll see. So first I want to run through the parts, then I'll talk about what happened with the build, and then we'll get into some gameplay results and see how this thing performs. Alright, for the parts, let's start off with the processor, and I'm using the i5-12400, and I won't lie, I chose this because I had GameStop credit and they had it in stock. Now, if you were just buying a part off the shelf, you could get the 12400F and save a few bucks, or if you wanted a little more CPU performance, you could go up to the 12600K or 13600K. The K chips, you might want a little better cooler than this though. I think the 12400 is still going to be plenty fine because I'm going to be gaming at 4K, but if you were at 1080p or 1440p, you might want a little better CPU performance. The motherboard we're going to put the chip into is the Z690i Aorus Ultralight DDR4, and this is a Z690 board, so it is going to be a little bit more expensive than the B or H boards, but this has a couple of pretty useful features. First of all, it has Wi-Fi built in, and second of all, it has 2 NVMe slots, which not a lot of the ITX boards have. I don't have a box for the memory out here, but I used a 32 gig kit of Corsair low profile RAM. Now 32 gigs, probably kind of overkill for the i5, but it wasn't that much more expensive to go for 32, and it gives me a little more headroom and flexibility, plus you can always upgrade the CPU later if you want to. The 12400 does come with the Intel stock cooler, which should handle the chip fine, but I went ahead and got a Ventru V5 air cooler. This came with the LGA 1700 bracket and it matches the build. Another reason I chose the Ventru is because I could get a standalone Ventru fan that matched it exactly, so I can have matching fans on the CPU cooler and for the exhaust. We got plenty of storage going on in this thing. With those 2 NVMe slots, we have the boot drive as a Gen 4 Samsung 980 Pro, and then we have another 2TB Gen 3 drive just for game storage. Now for the GPU, I've recently upgraded my desktop back there to the 4090, so I took the 3080 Ti that was in there and we've put it in this little case, and I think paired up with the 12400, it's going to be a pretty decent combo for 4K gaming out on the TV. And then of course the case itself, we have the Fractal Torrent Nano. It's a ITX case. It's a little bigger than a lot of ITX cases, but it will only fit an ITX motherboard. It does let you fit a nice size graphics card without needing riser cables or vertical mounts or anything like that. And you can also use a standard ATX power supply. So it is smaller than most larger cases like this 4000D, but it's not anywhere near as small as some of the really tiny ITX builds out there. So those are the parts. Now let's talk about the build and the problems that I ran into. Mostly it went together fine until I started trying to put the cooler on, at which point I noticed that the heat pipes interfered with where the heatsink for the M2 drives on the motherboard fit, and I had to just take that heatsink off. So the boot drive is still touching a thermal pad and some stuff in there, but the game storage drive is just kind of open and exposed. I haven't had any problems with it yet, and it's a Gen 3 drive I'm using for storage, so it probably won't be an issue, but it's not really something you'd want to do for your boot drive. However, it seems to be working fine the way it is, so I'm just going to roll with it like that for now. The other problem I ran into was with the M2 drives themselves. Now, because there's 2 of them, there's this little daughter board thing that like clips on, and it holds 1 drive on each side. When I was first building it, the 980 Pro 1TB I'm using for the boot drive was still on the way, and I had the 2TB drive from a previous system. I went ahead and put it together. I had the 2TB drive in there, and for whatever reason the BIOS wouldn't see it, the Windows installer wouldn't see it. I tried all sorts of different stuff. I took it back apart, I made sure it was seated properly, did all types of stuff, and it was a huge pain trying to get to it every time once the cooler had been installed, because it was really tight trying to get that little board in and out around the cooler. I tried a whole bunch of different stuff and I could never get the BIOS to see that 2TB drive. A couple of days later, the 980 Pro came and it recognized that no problem, and once I installed Windows on there, the system saw the 2TB drive and everything has worked properly since then. But that initial setup and trying to get it up and running, I just could not make it happen, so that was pretty frustrating. I don't think that was a problem with the motherboard necessarily. I think it may have just been something with the formatting of the drive. I had formatted the drive to regular NTFS in the old system, so it was blank, but for whatever reason, it just wouldn't recognize it until I had Windows up and running on the new drive. So those were a couple annoying problems that took some time and stuff to troubleshoot and get it up and running, but since it's been up and running, it's been performing really well. The temperatures are decent. There is a little lack of breathing room, I feel, for the 3080 Ti, but it doesn't seem to run a lot hotter than it did in my desktop. I normally ran it undervolted, and I have the same undervolt on in here, and it's maybe just, 1 or 2 degrees higher, so can't really complain there. One other quirk I just thought of when I was building it was routing the 8-pin cables under the card. So the first time I started it up, one of the cable combs was clipping the fan, and I had to take it back apart, but just massaging the cables, getting them to lay all nicely, and then getting the card installed without doing any extra wrenching or pulling the cables extra tight seemed to do the job, and now it's been running for several days and there hasn't been any problems with interference with the fans. So after those minor headaches and some time and troubleshooting, we've got our nice 4K gaming PC put together, so let's see how it performs in some 4K games. Alright, starting off with a couple of benchmarks, we have Times by Extreme, and we got 8,441 with a GPU score of a little over 10,000 and then a CPU score of 4,285, so that's pretty decent. The 12400 is definitely the weak link. Then in 3D Mark Port Royal, we got 13,192, and that's a pretty respectable score, so we should expect some decent performance in ray-traced games. Now we have the new Call of Duty Warzone 2.0, and this is a Battle Royale match, and running natively at pretty high settings, I was only getting around 60 frames per second, but I put it on high preset with DLSS on quality, and that got me closer to 80 to 100 frames per second, and it definitely felt more responsive during gameplay. Your performance obviously will vary depending on the location and the number of players that are around and everything, but I think running at pretty high settings with the DLSS on quality, you're going to get good performance on something like a 3080 Ti like this. The 12400 seemed to keep up with the card in this game, the GPU utilization was pretty high most of the time, so it doesn't seem like the kind of weak 12400 is a bottleneck in this game, at least at 4K. Next is Elden Ring, and this is running at 4K on the maximum graphics settings. And once again, the 12400 and 3080 Ti seem to keep up pretty well with this at 4K. You can tell that we're hitting about max GPU utilization and we're hitting 60 frames per second, so there's definitely places in the game that are going to be more intensive, so dropping a couple settings like anti-aliasing might be something you need to do if you're going to play this at 4K. Next is Forza Horizon 5, and this is running at native 4K on Ultra preset, but with the DLAA anti-aliasing instead of MSAA. I personally think that the DLAA looks less shimmery, and I think it looks a little bit better, at least to my eye. And again, we saw solid performance here, and came in with an average of 87 frames per second. Next is Red Dead Redemption 2, and we're running this at native 4K with DLSS off, but at a mix of different settings. We don't have everything maxed out. And again, we've got a really playable frame rate here at 4K. We're getting, between 70 to 90 frames per second, and so that's going to feel nice and responsive if you're playing some RDR2. This part of the benchmark is in Saint Denis, which is one of the most demanding parts of the game, so when you're out running around and exploring and stuff, you can expect even better frame rates. The average we had on this run was 77 frames per second. And finally, let's take a look at the new Uncharted 4 or Lost Thieves collection or whatever they're calling it. But this is Uncharted 4 from the PS4 remade for PC, and we're running this at 4K on the settings all the way up on max. And we got a really decent frame rate. It's close to 60, but for a game like this that was originally a console game, it feels really good, nothing to complain about, and it looks really nice and sharp at 4K. I never played this game on PS4, I played 1, 2, and 3 back on the PS3, so I'm kind of excited to give this one a playthrough. Alright, well, as you saw in the gameplay and benchmarks, this 12400 might not be the most powerful chip out there, but for 4K gaming, it's still plenty to push this 3080 Ti. I'm really happy with how the build came together in the end after the tribulations that we had, but I like the look of it. It has really good airflow. The grill on the front especially looks nice and modern. I like how you can use a full-size ATX power supply. If you're looking to do a smallish form factor build, but you don't necessarily want to go, with one of those cases where it's going to be a real pain to switch graphics cards or get in there and clean it and do stuff, you might want to take a look at this. Although, if you really need a small footprint, this isn't going to be the case for you. Thank you for watching along though. I hope this video was helpful or at least entertaining. If you liked it, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll catch you in the next video.